If you hit it right, the rewards are plentiful. You get to innovate, you get to figure out the roadmap together. There's a lot of goodness in this, but you have to put in a lot of energy as an enterprise in order to make sure you see it through. And so there would always be a very limited number of early stage startups that we would feel we can afford to engage with.
That's Maria Latushkin, GVP of Technology and Engineering at Albertsons, the second largest grocery chain in America. I interviewed her and Jack Berkowitz, Chief Data Officer at Securiti, to get an insider's perspective on how enterprise-level customers buy software and services from early-stage AI startups. The most surprising thing I learned came early in the chat. Spinning up a pilot program or a partnership with a startup creates tangible risks for enterprise customers, which means they can only afford to work with a few of them at a time.
Because at the end of the day, we only had so much energy. And so we would balance between established companies and 3 startups, maybe in actual execution. Maybe we're having discussions with others, but it's probably 2 or 3 at any one time.
Maria and Jack each have experience working inside early-stage startups, but their time working as C-level execs at public companies gives them a unique perspective on breaking into enterprise sales. In this episode, we'll talk about sales strategies, navigating the procurement process, how to run a proof of concept or pilot program, and other essential topics. I'm Walter Thompson. This is Fund, Build, Scale. More after this. Fund, Build, Scale is sponsored by Mayfield, the early-stage venture capital firm that takes a people-first approach to helping founders build iconic companies. The podcast is also sponsored by Securiti, pioneer of the Data Command Center, a centralized platform that enables the safe use of data and Gen AI. If you could just both say, Jack, starting with you, approximately how many vendors do you work with each year that are early stage startups?
It's a great question. In my last role where we were really encouraging startups to come because we were interested in the latest things in AI and ML. Even then we were sort of limited. We probably only had 3 at any one time coming through the system. Because at the end of the day, we only had so much energy. And so we would balance between established companies and 3 startups, maybe in actual execution. Maybe we're having discussions with others, but it's probably 2 or 3 at any one time.
Maria?
Same here. And the reason being is whether you are, like right now, I work for a public company, a really large public company, but even when I wasn't working for a large public company, there's a lot of responsibility you take on as a buyer, and you want to make sure that you do that well. So there's a lot of energy, as Jack says, that needs to be put in shepherding a very early stage company. There's the rewards. If you hit it right, the rewards are plentiful. You get to innovate, you get to figure out the roadmap together. There's a lot of goodness in this, but you have to put in a lot of energy as an enterprise in order to make sure you see it through. And so there would always be a very limited number of startups early stage startups that we would feel we can afford to engage with.
I mean, it sounds kind of like a partnership, not just a customer-client relationship.
It truly is. It truly is.
Interesting. So go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. Well, I was just going to say, it's a two-way partnership in a sense, because the startup wants to fail fast. And unfortunately for the executive or the team, failing fast is probably, on the enterprise side, is probably not the best outcome.
So I guess the same question is, how often are you someone's first customer?
Not in the company I'm at right now. Previously, we have been first customers, smaller companies I was at. And there's a lot that goes into ensuring that you are a safe first customer. And some of the things that you really have to think about, and that would be important for the startup to be able to have answers to, is how much risk do they introduce for the person, depending on what it is that they're developing, for the person that is a buyer or the person that is piloting, how easy or difficult is it to integrate with the company? Because the more you have to put in upfront, knowing that you're the first customer and it's really more of an unknown situation, you want to make this a smaller decision for the person that is partnering with you. And so the looser the integration, the less kind of upstart effort it requires, the better the company is at being able to demonstrate that the risk is going to be mitigated. There's never zero risk, but like to the extent that you can look under the covers and see how they would help you mitigate the risk, like that would be the important parts for us to consider.
Yeah, my last role it was at a Fortune 250 company. We were never the first customer, never. It just wouldn't hit our profile to be able to even deal with our procurement group and the insurance and the financing needed. What I would say though is when I was in smaller companies, 500-600 person companies, then yeah, we were happy to be the first customer because we had flexibility to be able to do it as well. And you know, the notion for me buying at or partnering at the Fortune 250 company is, well, tell you what, who do you have already? So if you got 10 or 15, then I'm comfortable, right? So 10 or 15 mid-size enterprises before you go to, you know, one of the biggest companies in the world.
And my advice, having been in small startups, my advice to startups would be not to target these really, really large companies because the amount of overhead that companies that are large established companies will present to this startup out of necessity, not on purpose, but they have to do certain things and they have to be able to guarantee certain things for their executive team, for their shareholders, may become too much overhead and may not actually be good at the end of it, good for the company. So maybe picking carefully who you want to target as your first customers or your first pilots is actually really important. Yeah. You don't want the company to quote unquote swallow you by all of the needs that it would have.
Yeah, I was just thinking of exactly the same thing, Maria, right? They call it whale hunting. You don't want the whale to pull you under.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a great analogy. I mean, yeah, that's a great analogy because everybody wants to land the whale. But yeah, so I mean, I'm getting all this Moby Dick imagery in my head, certainly. But so what are some of the consequences? It sounds like you're saying, an enterprise customer can literally make or break your business. So what does it look like when things go bad? What are some of the consequences for you as a client, as a customer, if things don't go well, if this partnership isn't paying off or doesn't bear fruit? What are you worried about going wrong?
There's a multitude of things. I mean, I'm not going to go into doomsday scenario, but I'll just, even on the surface, some of the things would be, I mentioned risk, right? What does this, depending on the type of the solution, depending on the partnership, managing risk is an important thing. Is that something that can introduce, whether that's vulnerabilities or it's some other risk to your company that you have to think about? That's one. Another one is the company solvency, right? Is if you have a business case and presumably you were counting on something as a company that this partner will deliver. In the case that they're not, what happens to that function? What happens to that need that you have as a customer? That is another thing that we always think about. Scale. If you pilot it and pilot goes well, and then you're trying to scale it to your whole operation, is that something that is going to work? Will they be able to scale with you both in terms of, traffic, volume, all of that, as well as maybe geographical needs, like other elements that scale introduces with it? Will they be able to continue to be a partner, or will you crush them with your needs? Like that's also something that is very important, both for the company because the company doesn't want to be crushed, and for the buyer because the buyer also wants to make sure that we're able to deliver with the solution that we're recommending.
And that can come into play even if it's a successful pilot. So you run a pilot, you run a POC, and you're ready to go. and suddenly, as a buyer, you're having to fund the company, right? Or find people to fund the company. And so it really is a dance as you move forward to make sure that the company is stable and able to grow with the big enterprise. And we had that recently where, thankfully we were able to help the one company get some additional funding. But in this environment right now, it was an interesting set of discussions, if you can imagine.
But there must have been some clear benefit for you at the other end if you're willing to extend yourself that far, I'm imagining.
Yeah. The system worked better than anything that we had seen and fit into our architectural approach. So it was worth it for us to extend and stretch further than we normally would because of the benefit on the other side, for sure.
So, Jack, in our pre-interview, you said something that stuck in my head. I asked you, when is it too early to talk to an enterprise customer? And you said, we can be brutal as far as, data and compliance and our systems and volumes. But you tempered that by saying you can talk to us, but don't sell to us. So what does that look like exactly? If someone's trying to figure out how to talk to you, how to sell to you, but they're not ready to do that yet, what's the customer? How do you want to experience customer discovery from your side of the desk?
Yeah. So I've been thinking a little bit about this. At the end of the day, at my level and at Maria's level, we're selling right now. I mean, that's part of our job is to sell, right? But we don't sell by going in and giving a 20-page PowerPoint pitch or pushing and pushing and pushing. We're selling through influence, selling through the ideas being there. So the conversation is really about the ideas. It's much more important to us as a big enterprise dealing with a startup. What's your long-term vision? What do you actually see? I don't care about your vision for making money or the fact that you're going to go, work remotely. That doesn't matter to me. But where do you see the technology space evolving? How do you see things evolving? Where are you going to play if things change in a different way? So really, I'm looking for that same discussion I might have with one of my peers, with my boss, with somebody in the business that I happen to be in, or in the technology business, technology area that I'm in. That conversation then helps me understand the product. But if you come in with a list of features and why you're better than some other company, and then what you don't do, I didn't know you didn't do that, and I don't even know that other company, right? It's more about, for me, understanding where you're headed and how you fit into, a technology landscape that's changing rapidly. I mean, today's technology landscape didn't even exist 12 months ago. And so that's what I'm really interested in.
To add to that, I would also say, I love what you said is in terms of the influence and really this whole selling process being a conversation. As buyers, we understand if you talk to a startup, we understand it's not as bulletproof as, a large enterprise that comes, it's given. And we don't expect that. We do expect vision. We do expect somebody to be innovative and knowing where the industry is going, where they're going, and that would be something that we would benefit from. The other thing is, my advice to startups would be to learn the customer. Unfortunately, too often I get into a discussion and with one or two questions, I understand that they don't really understand our business, don't know our business, and can't solve, or they're not even close enough to solving the business problems we may have. And that to me feels like, and the ones that did bother, they stand apart from me. The ones that actually learn the business or try to learn the business to the extent that they can, like did their homework, did their research, and are trying to be relevant to us in that conversation, that's important.
That's weird. Like going in totally cold doesn't make sense to me, but maybe it's just it's a volume game. They're just kind of trying to hit so many people. Maybe they don't bother to prep, or I don't know.
I think the thing is, particularly the ones that have raised money from venture capitalists, and I've raised over $100 million as part of management teams myself. You get so wrapped up into the venture capital world, thinking that they're your buyer and they're your customer. And to be frank, they're not. They're bankers, right? Some of them might have actually worked in a company, but a lot of them haven't. And I literally just hung up from a VC. Of course, they're getting information and trying to build things, but Your customer are the technologists sitting across the table at your customers. And so you really need to understand who they are and what's motivating them and what the company does. Way more important than the VC world.
So domain expertise, it sounds like we're kind of angling around that word, perhaps. Like that's kind of the middle of this, as far as if you're going to tell me you're going to solve my problem, you need to have some understanding, some frame of context for my problem and like the causes and so on and so forth. So how does someone get, am I wrong about that? That's a question, I suppose. Or am I making an assumption here? How much domain expertise do I need to sell to you as far as your...
You kind of have to know, so again, my last firm, we did a lot with moving data and moving payments and things like that. And so for us, coming in and talking about streaming information on public internet is probably not the thing we were interested in. We're moving systems into banking capabilities. So understanding that ahead of time is important.
And that takes us, it's always, in my opinion, it's always better to have successful first client, successful first implementation versus maybe the biggest one, right? And so picking that first one or the first couple is really important. If I had to do it, I would go and I would try to find out where my chances of success maximized. And having domain expertise, being able to speak from the point of like confidence and authority to some degree about the problems that you're solving for the customer does put some, winning points for you in that discussion, in that partnership, in that vision, and gives credibility. So I would work hard on trying to understand what my connections are. How can I get that domain expertise before I show up to that buyer?
And you hit it right. It's about connections. It's about the networking to go find that information. So, find businesses around the company, find businesses that have sold to the company, find people inside the company that can, hey, I'll spend 10 minutes explaining to you what this process is or that process is.
Even if they're not a buyer, there's a stakeholder who has a problem inside.
Yeah, they're influencing, or they may not even be connected, but they just have context and giving you context as to what you're selling into and what you're about to get into. Even in that process, you may be like, well, wait a second. I get the idea that I've got this meeting with a C-level person, but we can't actually help them. Do everybody a favor. Don't have the meeting, right?
Are you thinking about launching an AI startup? Mayfield's $250 million AI Start Seed Fund is actively searching for idea-stage entrepreneurs who are working at the cognitive plumbing layer. That's models, middleware and tools, data, infrastructure, and semiconductors and systems. Mayfield has a long track record. Since its founding, the firm has been an early investor in more than 550 companies, which has led to 120 IPOs and over 225 mergers and acquisitions. If you have a fundable idea for an AI-first startup, email aistart@mayfield.com. Every business that incorporates AI has to account for data privacy, compliance, and governance. That's why Securiti developed its Data Command Center. Instead of setting up different tools that can eat up time, money, and add complexity, Securiti's award-winning technology automates compliance with global privacy regulations, includes a library with more than 1,000 integrations across data systems, and identifies data risk to enable protection and control. To learn more, visit securiti.ai. So I wanted to talk about creating a framework for enterprise product development for AI startups. Maria, my first question for you is table stakes. What do enterprise customers want or need to hear before they sign with a new AI vendor in this environment?
AI is especially interesting. I would say that everything that I mentioned before in terms of the ability to scale, the security, compliance, all of the areas of how will we not get in trouble apply. In addition to which, I would try to understand, I would pay special attention as a buyer, and I would pay special attention as the person whose startup it is, in trying to articulate what is it that AI does, and being able to show to the buyer that it's done responsibly, that the best practices are in place, and that it's a little hard to answer because AI is a broad term, and depending what it is, the approach I would have would be different. But if I had to like really up level it, is ensuring that responsible AI practices are in place would be my number one concern, as well as security.
Yeah, and you probably don't need to be the one who invents it all. Talking about how you can take advantage either of things in the company's environment, or you've got partnerships with companies that build data governance or data security or whatever it happens to be, because you're adding these specific things. Now, if you happen to be in a data governance product, that's a different story, but do the pieces that make sense for you and clear about the borders for you. The other thing is, one of the big areas that is a concern right now is intellectual property rights, even of the models, right? So OpenAI works great, Gemini works great, all these other things work great, but what are the intellectual property rights of your company, and how do those relate? That would be an important thing to be understood.
And to that, and data as well in general, all of the data governance, the ownership of the data, origination of the data, especially as data gets transformed between the companies, if there's any data sharing or data creation between the enterprise and the startup.
Procurement teams are going to have, and remember, the procurement teams are going to be separate from the technical buyer or the business buyer. And in fact, most companies keep it separate. So don't ask the business buyer what the price is. Don't agree, because the procurement team is going to have a different story. They will actually have a structured set of requirements that you're going to need to meet, or you're going to need to at least discuss with them, whether it's liability insurance, if you have people coming on site, or all those other things that are involved in risk management. And it's best to get a relationship with the procurement team early. You can ask for it. You can ask the business buyer, the technical buyer, can you introduce me to procurement up front, even in the first meeting, because everybody knows that's going to take time. And I would suggest you do that, because that's that checklist.
So what does that process look like for both of you? I know it can vary, because we're talking in most cases, at least with regard to AI startups, this is brand new emerging technology in some ways. So how do you kick the tires, and what does that process look like from the inside?
So for me, we always will assign an individual responsible to shepherd and take the steps necessary for that company to come in. Sometimes there'll be two people, one person on technical integration and one more on the technology and business evaluation. Sometimes those would be different folks. But there is always one person who's going to have to be responsible for overseeing it. Otherwise, in a big company particularly, you might have 8, 10, 15 people involved, and it'll get unfocused as it moves forward.
Same principle with the one person for the same reasons. There's always this double, if somebody takes the lead, but there's always the second person to them. So sometimes maybe it would be business led, and there would be the technical lead who is the second person, but they're lockstep, or vice versa. Maybe it's a technical solution, but then you really ensure that from the finance perspective, the finance lead or a business lead, depending on the situation, is there. And then there are the parties that have veto rights of sorts, right? You make sure that from legal perspective, it checks all the boxes. From security perspective, it checks all the boxes. So there's this one stream that's pushing it through, shepherding it, and the other ones that get involved to make sure that there's kind of no harm will be done, right? So from the legal, security, and other depending on the situation, other areas.
And those groups to startups may seem that they're trying to block things, but they're not, right? Everybody's in there to move their company forward, but they're doing their job. And I think getting warm relationships with them as you go is only great experience, because those organizations are never going away as you continue to grow.
So ballpark it for me. How likely is it that a pilot is going to turn into a long-term contract? Just, generally speaking.
In my experience, it's about a 50-50. About half the time the pilots will move forward. Recently, we just had an example over the past year where we did a pilot with one company. It was very successful, but what we found out was we weren't ready for them. And unfortunately for them, a second company showed up that we were better positioned to be able to handle. So that company hadn't been in the pilot, but we never even needed to do a pilot with the second company. You know, and the first company was objecting, well, how can you do that? You didn't do a pilot. It's like, well, we kind of did. It was as much learning on our side about how we needed to organize and what we needed to do. And it's unfortunate, but, you know, that was the case.
The really important part for startups to keep in mind is that the pilot on the buyer's side is not to prove out technology. It's to prove out the business model. And most of the time on the buyer's side, they are actually expecting technology to work. Mm-hmm. So there might be a pre-pilot or POC or something you do on the side, etc. But by the time you get to pilot, that's where, especially for large companies, they expect the technology to work. And it's for them to prove out the business model, to prove out it's the pilot for that company to see if they can roll it out. Now, if the company gets, to rephrase your question, Walter, is if the company gets to that stage of the pilot when the technology works, and it's a question of the business model, and it's a question of the user experience or whatever else needs to happen, then I would also say it's about 50-50. Like sometimes another company shows up with a better business model, or some other circumstances change. But at that point, if it did go through pilot and pilot proved to be working well, I'd say it's probably 50-50, right? It's difficult to get to pilot. I would say that out of the number of companies that we talk to, the number of companies that make it to pilot, that's the smaller number, because very often you see that there's not a fit or the tech is not ready or something else you're able to see quickly enough before getting into a pilot.
Yeah. And then as we were talking earlier, the opportunity cost to take something to a pilot. It's just, you can only handle so much as a throughput in a company at any one time. Even if it's the biggest company, it doesn't have infinite resources and attention and everything else. And those people are doing other jobs all at the same time. And so, it limits the number of companies that can get to a true pilot. A POC is not a pilot. A project is not a pilot. A pilot is, hey, we're going to instrument the United States, or we're going to instrument California, massive places.
Scale, right?
Scale.
So for runway-minded founders who are looking at their bank balance, and I know there's no single path for this, but how long between getting a yes to go into a pilot program to them getting some money out of the back end, realizing revenue from that pilot?
In my experience, we don't really want to have pilots run that long. And so, you might only see a pilot run 90 days. And if you can't prove what it's doing in 60 to 90 days, then we've got an issue. In fact, well-run pilots will have almost weekly cadence. And so, within a few days if it's working. It's important to have your sort of first land contract spec'd in parallel. In fact, a lot of procurement agency groups won't allow the pilot to start without having that spec'd and agreed. I think startups should realize that land and expand is probably going to be a better way for any company also. So if the pilot has the scope of California, but the company does business around the world, expect that the first project's going to be California, right? Because it's easy to just roll it. And then, you'll get later contracts as it goes.
I would also to add to this, agree with everything. And to add to this, I would always ask, to the extent you can in the beginning, what the budgeting cycles or what does it take in a company to get to further steps? Because I've seen, being in the startup, I've seen sometimes it's you get to pilot, you get to verify the pilot, but it doesn't mean that this is the time for the contract. And it might be that elapsed time when we think about runway, elapsed time between pilot can be verified within 90 days, but then there might be elapsed time to the contract, maybe much longer. And it will depend on a variety of factors, and every company will have its own variety of factors. So for a startup working with the company for the first time, I would find that out, not to be then put in a situation where I would be really anxious.
Yeah. Awesome. Thanks. The engineers I've talked to, just a few so far, but it seems that many of them really, they don't like coding new features for a single client, but that's something that seems probably likely to come up during a pilot program. Maria, is that a consideration for you? And how often would you be likely to ask for something like a special feature that you knew that would benefit you, but not necessarily their entire platform?
I try not to do that. I try to explain. Sometimes they're early enough where they have not necessarily thought through kind of my cohort of clients like me. And I would tell them, like, you actually should do this because there will be more than clients like me. I would, unless this is something so specific for our business that is without which we can't do it, the whole idea of partnering with somebody is not to have something really esoteric that can never be upgraded, that's done specifically for you. It's to actually create a platform that would be general purpose enough, that's like full of best practices versus something that's very bespoke and esoteric. Of course, there are cases when your business requires it to be something different, but otherwise I wouldn't do it.
Yeah, I think, Maria, right? Would you agree? I not only wouldn't do it, I want them to have other clients. I want them to grow their business. We need them to be successful. We need them to grow to hundreds of clients and everything else. We don't want to be the only customer because it just creates a bad situation. So
Codependency, not a good thing in business.
Codependency. No, you want, I think it gets into this thing also, like, are you willing to take a call on behalf of a startup? Well, if it proves to be successful and everything's going well, yeah, because your best salesperson is going to be, your early customers, and you want them to have other clients. You want them to meet other clients too, right? You want that group of customers to be really supportive of you because it's in the best interest of the customer.
So in a pilot, in a scenario like this, what are some of the most common ways where founders are their own worst enemy, where they're sabotaging their own work or the likelihood of success without realizing it? Have you seen people kind of doing this without realizing?
Well, the biggest one to me is the dive bomb or the helicopter founder. So, the founder who either A, has the initial meeting and then, it's too important for them to go do other things than to be with you every day, or, checking in or dive bombing, where, the project teams meet, 30 days in or 45 days in, and then the founder shows up and tells everybody that they're doing things wrong. I think if the executive team and technical team is on a project and they're meeting every week, then the founders, particularly early stage, should be in those meetings every time. And I've seen this sort of helicopter or dive bomb. I don't know what the right word is. I've seen it too many times over the past few years, particularly with the AI startups, to be honest with you.
To add to this, I would also say that founders that don't listen to their customers, they miss the opportunity. They miss the mark. And there's always something you learn from potential customers, current customers, just being good listeners. And that would be my advice to founders. So many times over the course of my career, I would be in meetings where somebody said, oh, the other ones showed like more promise, but this one really understood my needs and the needs of our business, of what I was trying, really listened. And that would be the company that got the business. And the reverse of it is true as well. Companies that where the founder, especially when it's, founder is so important and founder sets the tone for the company in the beginning of its journey. If they don't listen, if they're not in tune with the actual needs, it's okay to say no. but it has to be an educated no. It has to be a no that comes after listening. And I would say that that's really, really important as well.
Yeah, and you can hear the language of, to follow what Maria said, you can sometimes hear the language of a professional product manager, or a professional founder who says things like, well, our customers think this. And quite frankly, our customers are telling us this. And you're sitting across the table like, well, I'm the customer. I'm not saying that. I'm saying something different. And there's a couple of big Valley FANG companies where there's this vocabulary that comes out of them. I don't know where it's come from, but it's really bad in an early stage company to say things like that.
I mean, I've heard product managers speak about how I've literally heard product managers say things like customers don't really know what they want.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, there's a certain hubris there. One of my last questions about pilot programs. So success fee agreements, what are they and how do they work in a pilot program to help everyone come out ahead at the end? Do either of you use them in your practice?
Yeah, I've used them quite a bit. And so what we'll do is it's really on the later stage contracts, right? The later stage of things. And what they are is essentially agreeing to a business objective or a commitment to a date. And so, something like 75% of the money will be under a normal contract, and then there'll be a bonus if you hit certain joint objectives. Now, that means that the customer also has to be responsible for seeing through their commitments. But if that's the case, then you can accelerate through some additional monies.
Maria, is that a device you've used in these contracts?
Yeah, something very similar. We're also ensure that we talk in the beginning of what happens to the data that we exchange, any artifacts, etc. In the case, in both cases, actually, whether we continue on or we don't.
Thanks very much to both of you for the time today. I really appreciate it. It's been a great conversation.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Thank you.
I'll be back with some show notes right after a few words from my sponsors. Fund to Build Scale is sponsored by Mayfield. If you have a fundable idea for an AI-first startup at the cognitive plumbing layer, email aistart@mayfield.com. The podcast is also sponsored by Securiti, pioneer of the Data Command Center, a centralized platform that enables the safe use of data and Gen AI. To learn more, visit security.ai. Thanks very much to my guests, Maria Latushkin and Jack Berkowitz. For my next episode, I spoke to Laura Bisesto, Global Head of Policy and Privacy at Nextdoor. We talked about the regulatory landscape facing AI startups in 2024 and how small companies should start the work of developing their own ethical frameworks. We got into how startups can recognize when they need legal help, recapped some data governance best practices, and also talked about why it's so important to create a button-down process for rolling out new AI features. If you've listened this far, I hope you got something out of the conversation. Subscribe to Fund Build Scale so you'll automatically get future episodes, and consider leaving a review. For now, you can find the Fund Build Scale newsletter on Substack. The show theme was written and performed by Michael Tritter and Carlos Chairez. Michael also edited the podcast and provided additional music. Thanks very much for listening.